What if I told you that the chaos you're witnessing in the world right now, wars, inflation, collapsing trust in institutions, isn't random at all? That we're living through a predictable pattern, one that has repeated for centuries. Welcome to the unfiltered truth of changing world order and national cycles. This isn't just a book, it's a map of power, prosperity, and collapse. If you want to thrive in a future shaped by global tectonic shifts, you must understand the life cycles of nations, the economic tipping points, and the dangerous myths that blind entire civilizations. In this episode, we'll break open the core principles behind historical power transitions and uncover how the rise and decline of empires directly impacts your wealth, career, and mental edge. But we're going further because knowledge alone isn't power. Application is. That's why at the end, you'll face a precision-designed knowledge check to cement these insights into your brain, giving you a real, measurable upgrade in strategic thinking. And yes, there's a powerful surprise that ties today's ideas directly to your personal advantage. Get ready. This episode will reshape the way you see history, economics, and even your own potential. Let's begin.
You know, we often think of history as, well, just a static thing, right? Like a list of dates and names in a textbook.
Yeah, something dusty on a shelf.
Exactly. But what if it's actually more dynamic? Like a process, a repeating cycle maybe, with predictable stages, almost like, I don't know, the lifespan of a living organism. For those of you looking to really cut through the noise, gain some real understanding of the forces shaping our world, become truly well-informed, quickly and thoroughly well, this deep dive is designed just for you.
Absolutely. Today, we're diving into the really interesting research of Ray Dalio. We're focusing on his concept of the big cycle, the rise and decline of world powers. And this isn't about just random ups and downs. It's about these fundamental recurring patterns that seem to drive these massive shifts in global influence.
And yeah, as always, we've been digging through the material you shared. Our mission today is pretty straightforward, really. We want to pull out the most crucial insights about the stages of this big cycle.
Right.
Identify the key factors that, make it turn, and maybe pinpoint where major global players like the U.S. and China currently stand within it.
That's the plan.
Get ready for some hopefully surprising connections and a clear, understandable view of these complex dynamics. We'll try to avoid getting lost in all the tiny details.
Okay, let's get right to it then. The core idea of this big cycle concept is basically that empires, well, much like organisms, seem to have a life cycle.
A life cycle.
Yeah. There are these recurring patterns in how they rise, how they reach their peak, and then, how they eventually decline. And what's really striking, I think, is that these patterns seem to emerge for fundamentally similar reasons across different times, different places.
So it's not just a random series of events. There's a structure to it, you're saying?
Precisely. The big cycle, essentially, it swings between these relatively long periods of peace and prosperity.
The good times.
Yeah, the good times, great innovation, rising living standards, and then these shorter, more turbulent periods. Think depression, revolution, war, times when the struggle for wealth and power just leads to massive upheaval.
And you mentioned a ratio.
What's fascinating, is this approximate 5-to-1 ratio in their duration. The more constructive, peaceful phases, they tend to be much longer.
Okay, that kind of aligns with our general sense of things, right? Stability feels normal, and the big disruptions feel, disruptive.
And that's a really key insight. These major bust periods, the real turning points in the cycle, they're actually infrequent, often happening only once in a lifetime.
Wow.
Yeah. That's why they can be so jarring, so surprising to people who haven't really studied these long-term historical patterns, across generations.
Give me an example.
Okay, think about it. The incredible economic boom after World War II, almost unimaginable for people who had just lived through the Great Depression and a devastating global war.
Right. Completely different worlds.
Completely. And conversely, those of us who maybe only experienced relatively stable, maybe debt-fueled growth, well, the idea of a major depression or a really large-scale conflict might seem, abstract, hard to grasp.
It really highlights how our own personal experience can kind of limit our understanding of what's possible, doesn't it?
It really does.
You also mentioned something about how money has changed within these cycles.
Yes, that's crucial. A major shift to understand is the move from hard money linked to gold, like after World War II under Bretton Woods, to soft, or fiat money,
Fiat money meaning?
meaning its value isn't tied to a physical commodity like gold. Governments adopted these fiat currencies, largely to allow for more borrowing, frankly, and to prevent widespread bankruptcies when facing big economic challenges, especially back in the 1970s.
Okay.
So now the kind of prevailing approach for many is just to borrow even more, despite this really clear historical link between these practices and, well, periods of significant economic downturn and conflict.
So how societies manage debt and the type of money they use, that's a critical factor in this big cycle.
Absolutely critical. Understanding these past connections, it isn't just some academic exercise. It has real-world implications.
Right. For how we navigate things now.
Definitely. Our ability to navigate the future, both individually and, as societies, really depends on understanding these cause and effect relationships that have driven major historical shifts.
I think Dalio mentioned making mistakes by not seeing things that hadn't happened in his own career.
Exactly. He's talked about how some of his biggest investment mistakes came from exactly that, not recognizing major market changes that hadn't happened recently, but were, well documented in longer historical cycles. That's a powerful lesson for all of us, I think.
Yeah, those blind spots created by the limits of our own direct experience.
That's it. And when you look at the sort of recurring core struggles throughout history, well, the pursuit of wealth and power, how it's made, how it's taken, how it's distributed, that consistently takes center stage.
Always about the money and power.
Pretty much. These fundamental drivers, maybe along with conflicts over ideology, religion sometimes, they play out in these cyclical patterns we're discussing.
And who are the main players in this recurring historical drama?
Well, throughout history, there's been this consistent dynamic, right, between the wealthy, those who control the resources, the means of production, and those who hold political power, the ones making and enforcing the rules.
The relationship between capital and state, essentially.
Kind of. The specific roles, how they interact, that evolves, sure. You go from landowners and monarchs and agrarian societies to, say, capitalists and political leaders in our modern system. But the underlying tension, the interdependence between economic and political power, that remains remarkably similar.
So when we look at the world today, what's the big picture takeaway from Dalio's perspective?
If we connect all this to the overarching narrative, well, what we're likely witnessing now, according to Dalio's analysis, is a classic major shift in relative wealth and power, a fundamental reshaping of the global order.
A big turning point.
A big one. And it's a kind of transition that can be really difficult to fully appreciate if you don't have that longer historical perspective, right? To recognize it as, oh, this is one of those recurring major turning points. The key insight here is that these shifts aren't random. They seem to follow a predictable pattern.
And are there specific factors that drive these massive global realignments? You mentioned determinants.
Yes, Dalio identified 18 important determinants that help explain this ebb and flow of empires.
18.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating is that these factors tend to be mutually reinforcing within the big cycle, like interconnected gears in a big machine, driving that wave of rise and eventual decline.
Okay, 18 sounds like quite a bit to keep track of. Are there maybe a few key gears, the most critical ones to watch?
Yes, definitely. While they all contribute in some way, 3 cycles really stand out as particularly influential.
Okay, what are they?
First, the long-term debt and capital market cycle. Second, the internal order and disorder cycle, what's happening within nations. And third, the external order and disorder cycle, what's happening between nations.
Debt, internal order, external order.
Got it. Understanding those 3 gives you a really powerful lens for analyzing what's going on globally.
Okay, let's start with the debt cycle then. What's the recurring pattern we see throughout history there?
Well, the cyclical nature of debt crises is just a constant theme. It's almost predictable. Excessive debt builds up. Individuals, companies, even whole countries. And eventually it reaches a point where they struggle to repay or even just refinance their obligations. There are simply too many IOUs out there relative to the available money and, the actual economic activity happening.
So the bubble gets too big.
Pretty much. And this often triggers defaults, which can then lead to financial panics. And frequently that leads to government intervention, often to printing more money.
Right, the bailout phase.
Exactly. This boom-bust sequence, driven by the buildup and then the bursting of these debt bubbles, it's been a recurring pattern for centuries. So the key insight, unsustainable debt levels are a major, major precursor to economic downturns.
Okay, and how has the fundamental source of wealth and power shifted over, the really long arc of history.
Well, if you connect this to the bigger picture of how societies become more productive, think about the development of capitalism, entrepreneurship, the Industrial Revolution.
Huge shifts.
Huge shifts.
Mm.
We see wealth and power gradually move away from being primarily based on land ownership, where the traditional elites held sway. It moved towards an economy increasingly driven by industry and innovation.
Factories, technology.
Right. And in this evolving model, you had inventive capitalists owning the factories, the means of production, increasingly collaborating with government to maintain a system that, well, benefited
It
them.
makes sense.
Since the Industrial Revolution, really, it's been the combination of widespread education, technological innovation, and a capitalist system working together with government that's been the primary engine of wealth and power. So the ability to foster that innovation and productivity, crucial determinant of long-term success.
What about periods of war? How do they factor into this economic cycle? They must disrupt things massively.
They do. War periods, while they do lead to increased production in specific sectors, armaments, military supplies,
Sure.
they generally result in an overall decline in economic well-being, despite maybe higher per-person output in some metrics because everyone's working on the war effort.
Right, focused production.
The widespread destruction of resources, infrastructure, human capital. It means that global GDP per capita typically falls significantly during major conflicts.
So a net negative overall?
Definitely. These periods act as these brutal stress tests for the global order. They clarify who the rising and falling powers are, and they often lead to a significant reset of the world order. We saw that very clearly after World War II, didn't we?
Absolutely.
The key takeaway is that while war can sometimes lead to a redistribution of power, it almost always comes at a significant economic cost.
It's a grim reality, but I suppose that reset is part of this larger cycle you're describing.
Yeah, it seems to be. And interestingly, some individuals who have lived through these really difficult times, they even report unexpected positive outcomes.
Like what?
Like a greater sense of community, maybe. The development of resilience, adaptability. The generation that lived through the Great Depression and World War II is often lauded for their strength of character.
The greatest generation?
Right. But it's important to remember that these periods of intense economic destruction and war, they're typically shorter in duration within the overall big cycle, often lasting just a few years, maybe a bit longer.
Okay. So we've looked at some of the downswings. What does the initial rise of an empire actually look like in practice? What are the key characteristics?
The rise phase typically begins with the emergence of strong, capable leadership. Leaders who can establish an effective system for increasing the nation's overall wealth and power.
Strong leadership is step one.
Seems to be. And a consistent hallmark of historically successful empires is a strong, sustained emphasis on education.
Makes sense.
And this isn't just about, academic learning. It also involves cultivating essential character traits. Think discipline, civility, a strong work ethic, often instilled through families, schools, cultural norms.
So values matter.
Hugely. When done effectively, this fosters greater respect for rules and laws, reduces corruption, encourages collaboration, all aimed at improving overall productivity. So yeah, a strong foundation of leadership and what we call human capital is essential for that ascent.
And this focus on education and these character traits, what tangible outcomes do they lead to?
Well, the better a country cultivates these qualities, the more it progresses, right? From just producing basic goods to actively engaging in innovation, creating new technologies, new ideas.
Like the Dutch Golden Age you mentioned?
Exactly. The Dutch Golden Age is a perfect example. At their peak, a remarkably high percentage of major global inventions originated in the Netherlands. Shipbuilding, early finance.
Wow.
And this kind of innovation is usually fueled by an openness to global perspectives, a willingness to learn, adopt best practices from anywhere, and strong collaboration between the workforce, the government, the military.
So it's not just one thing, it's a combination.
It's a combination. The key insight here is that innovation, driven by an educated and collaborative society, is a major engine of economic growth and rising global influence.
So it's like a positive feedback loop, a virtuous cycle of learning and building.
Precisely. This increased productivity, this innovation, it leads to greater competitiveness in global markets, which then shows up as a rising share of world trade.
Like we see with the US and China now, big shares of trade.
Exactly. They have roughly comparable levels of economic output now, significant shares of global trade. And as a nation's global trade expands, naturally, it needs to develop the military strength necessary to protect its vital trade routes, its growing foreign interests. This successful upward spiral tends to reinforce itself over time.
Okay. Now let's dig a bit deeper into some of those determinants you mentioned before. You said history rhymes. What's the core meaning behind that idea? It's not just repeating.
Right.
It?
Not repeating exactly.
Yeah.
What's really insightful here is that history rhymes not because specific events repeat in precise detail, but because the fundamental cause and effect relationships, the things that drive human behavior, societal development, they seem to be timeless and universal.
Okay.
However, the specific ways these underlying relationships manifest, that can and does evolve as societies change, technologies change, global circumstances change.
So look for the underlying principles.
That's the key. By studying analogous events across different historical periods, different places, we can gain a clear understanding of these enduring fundamental drivers. Look for the principles, not just the surface-level similarities.
You mentioned 18 determinants. Maybe we can explore a few that seem particularly relevant today. Geography, for instance, that seems like a pretty constant factor.
Geography, yeah. Determinant number 1. The physical characteristics of a country, its location, its neighbors, its terrain. It plays a foundational role, absolutely.
So?
Well, think about the large, relatively contiguous land masses of both the United States and China, bordered by oceans or mountains, natural barriers. Historically, that's fostered a greater degree of internal unity, a shared identity among their populations.
Compared to, say, Europe.
Exactly. Contrast that with Europe's more fragmented geography. Historically, that contributed to its division into numerous distinct states, often with less of a shared sense of common identity. So the key insight is geography can significantly influence a nation's internal cohesion and how it interacts with its neighbors.
That makes intuitive sense. What about something less tangible, like human capital? How does that factor in?
Human capital, yeah. In this context, it basically refers to the overall ability of a nation's people to generate more economic value than they consume. Dalio calls it self-sufficient plus.
Self-sufficient plus. I like that.
That's a good phrase. It's essentially the bedrock of financial strength for individuals, companies, and, by extension, entire nations.
And what builds that?
High-quality education, a deeply ingrained culture of hard work and cooperation, effective systems for skills training, development, all crucial for improving human capital and achieving that self-sufficient plus state. Societies that lack strong human capital often find themselves struggling economically and competitively.
So a productive, skilled population is the most valuable asset.
Absolutely. Key takeaway.
Okay, what about the inherent drive to gain and keep wealth and power? That seems like a constant motivator throughout history. How does that play out in the big cycle?
Determinant number 6, yeah. The drive to gain and keep wealth and power. Undeniably, a powerful, persistent motivator. Individuals, organizations, nations, everyone feels it.
What?
But long-term success, stability, that requires a nation to consistently earn at least as much as it spends. Simple as that, really. Those entities, countries, companies, whatever that prioritize modest spending, maintain a surplus. They're far more sustainable over time than those that consistently operate with large deficits.
History backs that up.
Oh, absolutely. History provides ample evidence that consistently spending beyond your means eventually leads to significant challenges. So the key insight, that drive for wealth has to be balanced with fiscal responsibility.
And what about the role of well-functioning capital markets? How important are they?
Hugely important. Well-developed, efficient capital markets. The systems that allow for savings, investment, allocating financial resources, they are absolutely essential for a country's overall financial health, and therefore a critical determinant of its success within the big cycle. Because these markets facilitate the flow of capital to productive uses. They foster innovation, growth. A key takeaway is that robust financial infrastructure is just vital for economic dynamism.
You mentioned earlier that China seems particularly adept at learning from history. Why is that such a significant advantage? Determinant 8, I think.
Determinant number 8, yeah. The ability to learn from history. It's often underestimated, but it's profoundly important. Think about it. Our individual personal experience is inherently limited.
Sure, we only live so long.
Exactly. Many of the most critical lessons for navigating major societal shifts come from events that happened before our time. In fact, future events can sometimes be the complete opposite of what we've personally experienced.
Like the boom after the Depression example.
Precisely. The economic and social conditions during a long, peaceful boom are drastically different from those during a major war or a deep depression. If a society doesn't have a strong understanding of historical patterns going back at least a century, probably more, it's at a significantly higher risk of being caught unprepared by major turning points.
And China has that long view.
China, with its incredibly long, well-documented history and its cultural emphasis on historical study, appears to have a very strong awareness of these long-term cycles. The key insight is that historical knowledge provides this crucial lens for understanding the present and maybe anticipating potential futures.
Okay, let's delve into internal divisions within societies. Class struggles, determinant 17, that feels particularly relevant in today's world.
It really does. Determinant 17, class struggles, it just highlights the fact that societies throughout history have been divided into various classes, right?
Well,
Based on wealth, race, religion, political affiliation.
the usual fault lines.
The usual fault lines. Now, early in the big cycle, there tends to be a greater degree of social harmony, maybe a shared purpose.
Coming together after a crisis, perhaps?
Perhaps. But as times become more challenging, particularly towards the later stages of the cycle, these underlying divisions often become much more pronounced. And that leads to increased social and political conflict. This intensified class warfare can have a significant destabilizing impact on internal order.
So social cohesion erodes as empires age and face pressure.
That seems to be the pattern. Key takeaway there.
And how does the traditional political spectrum, the political left-right cycle, determinant 18, how does that interact with these broader historical trends?
Determinant 18, the political left-right cycle,
Yeah.
basically describes the different core ideologies, right? You have capitalists, typically associated with the right, who generally emphasize individual self-sufficiency, limited government, and then socialists, typically associated with the left, who tend to prioritize wealth redistribution, a more active role for government in addressing social and economic inequalities.
Different priorities.
Fundamentally different views on the optimal role of government, and even on what truly constitutes productivity. That often leads to significant political disagreements, shifts in policy over time.
Like who creates value?
Exactly. Capitalists often focus on individual productivity, profit, as key drivers. Socialists might place a greater emphasis on broader societal well-being, collective outcomes. The key insight is that these fundamental ideological differences play out in recurring political cycles and really influence how societies respond to the challenges of the big cycle.
This brings up an important distinction you mentioned. When we talk about wealth in this context, what exactly are we referring to? There's a difference.
Yes, it's absolutely crucial to distinguish between what Dalio calls real wealth and financial wealth.
Okay, what's the difference?
Real wealth is the actual stuff, goods and services people need and want, things that have intrinsic value, food, shelter, education, infrastructure.
Things you can use.
Exactly. Financial wealth, on the other hand, is made up of financial assets, stocks, bonds, cash. It represents claims on future real wealth, but it doesn't have intrinsic value in itself, just paper or bits in a computer.
So claims versus actual stuff.
Right. And ultimately, creating sustainable wealth in the long run, that's directly linked to being productive, producing more real goods and services. Financial wealth, inheritances alone, they don't last indefinitely. Continuous productivity is essential for the long-term well-being, the prosperity of a society.
So real productive capacity is the true measure of a nation's wealth.
That's the key insight, absolutely.
So how do countries tend to behave at different stages of this wealth cycle? Are there typical patterns in their mindset?
Dalio outlines several stages. In what he calls stage 2, countries have become relatively rich, but they still kind of retain this cultural mindset of being poor or striving.
Still hungry.
Still hungry, exactly. This often leads to a strong emphasis on hard work, high savings rates, efficient investment in productive assets, education, infrastructure, R&D. This stage is often characterized by rapid growth, increasing global competitiveness.
Okay, that's stage 2. What about later stages?
Contrast that with stage 4. Here, countries may have actually become relatively poorer in terms of global standing, but they still operate with this lingering think rich mentality, maybe based on past successes.
Resting on their laurels.
Kind of. And this can result in rising levels of debt, lower savings rates, reduced investment in future productivity, and a greater reliance on past reputation rather than current innovation and efficiency.
Interesting. So a nation's psychological mindset about its wealth can really impact its economic path.
Significantly. That's a key insight.
We've covered the long-term economic cycle, some key determinants. Now let's turn our attention to the internal order and disorder cycle within nations. What's the dynamic there?
Okay, this cycle examines how the governing systems, the social structures within individual countries evolve and, how stable they are, and then how these internal dynamics interact with the external order, the balance of power between nations.
And where are we now, generally?
Well, currently we're observing increasing levels of internal disorder in several leading countries around the world, perhaps most notably, Dalio would argue, in the United States. The key insight is that internal stability isn't a given. It follows its own cyclical patterns.
What are the typical stages we see in this internal order cycle as it unfolds? How does it usually go?
Typically, the cycle begins with a new order emerging, usually after some period of upheaval. You get a strong leader or group consolidating power, establishing new rules, new norms.
Stage 1, new boss.
Kind of, yeah. This initial phase is often followed by a period of building and refining institutions, bureaucracies. The things needed to allocate resources, govern effectively.
Setting up the system.
Right. If successful, this can lead to a prolonged period of relative peace and prosperity.
The good times again.
But this can then sow the seeds for future problems, potentially leading to excessive spending, too much debt, widening gaps, wealth gaps, political influence gaps, even values gaps.
Cracks start to appear.
Exactly. Eventually, these stresses can culminate in worsening financial conditions, intensifying social and political conflict, potentially escalating to civil unrest or even revolutions, which then, of course, brings about a new order, and the cycle begins again.
Full circle. You mentioned a consolidation of power purge period after major revolutions or shifts in power. What does that typically involve? Sounds ominous.
It can be, yeah. After a significant revolution or a fundamental shift in who's in charge, there's often this subsequent period where the new leaders move to eliminate any remaining opposition to their rule.
Getting rid of rivals.
Essentially. This purge phase can also involve internal power struggles among the new leadership as they compete to solidify their own control. The nature, the severity of this consolidation period, it varies hugely depending on the specific historical context, the ideologies involved. The key insight is just that major power transitions are often followed by a period of instability as the new order tries to establish itself.
What are some of the danger signs? Things that might indicate escalating internal conflict within a society? What should we look out for?
Dalio points to what he calls a classic toxic mix of factors that often precedes significant internal conflicts.
Okay, what's in the mix?
First, a nation in poor financial shape. Second, large and growing gaps, income gaps, wealth gaps, and gaps in deeply held values among the population. And third, a significant negative economic shock that just makes all the existing tensions worse.
Bad finances, big divisions, and a shock. Sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It really is. This confluence of factors creates fertile ground for social and political disorder. We also often see, in the later stages, the increasing weaponization of media, of information.
Yeah, we see that now.
Leading to declining trust in institutions, a climate where individuals might fear expressing dissenting opinions openly. And as these conflicts intensify, as the ability to find common ground breaks down, the system can edge closer to more severe forms of civil unrest, even outright civil war or revolution.
So economic hardship plus deep social and political divisions equals instability.
That's the key insight, a highly unstable environment.
It sounds quite concerning.
Yeah.
Are there specific ways this internal disorder typically manifests in society as things get worse?
Well, late in the cycle, it's not uncommon to see legal systems, police systems, being increasingly used as political tools, targeting opponents. The rise of private security forces can also become more prevalent as faith in public institutions erodes. We often observe an increase in the frequency, the intensity of violent protests. And leaders face this incredibly difficult challenge. How do you manage these without further escalating tensions and potentially triggering a more widespread breakdown of order?
A real tightrope walk.
Absolutely. The key takeaway is that the very institutions meant to maintain order can themselves become sources of conflict in the later stages of the cycle.
Can you give us some historical examples of how these internal order changes have played out, maybe some different outcomes?
Sure. England's Glorious Revolution in 1688, that represents a relatively peaceful transition of power, but one that still significantly reshaped the internal order.
Okay, relatively peaceful.
In contrast, think about Japan's Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century. That was a result of a 3-year period of internal conflict, sparked partly by external pressures, this desire for rapid modernization. It led to a fundamental restructuring of Japanese society and governance. So very different paths, different levels of violence, but both major internal order shifts.
Highlighting the range of possibilities. Okay, now let's shift our focus outwards. How nations interact with each other, the external order and disorder cycle. What are the key dynamics at play there?
Right, this cycle deals with the constantly evolving balance of power and the relationships between different countries on the global stage. Dalio identifies 5 primary types of warfare that can occur between nations.
5 types. Okay.
First, trade or economic war. Second, technology war. Third, capital war, that's financial. Fourth, geopolitical influence war. And fifth, ultimately, military conflict.
Trade, tech, capital, geopolitics, military.
Got it. And it's crucial to understand that the first 4 types of conflict often precede and can escalate into actual military confrontations. The key insight is that competition between nations manifests in various forms, not just soldiers and tanks.
So it's not always about physical battles in the traditional sense, at least not initially. There's this buildup.
Exactly. Not in the early stages. When a nation is considering whether to negotiate or maybe engage in more direct conflict with another power, a critical factor is its assessment of power dynamics. How is its own power likely to change over time compared to its rival's power?
Timing matters.
Hugely. Ideally, a nation wants to negotiate, or if necessary, fight, when its relative power is at its peak, or perceived to be. Demonstrating power, resolve, that can be an effective negotiating tactic. But it also carries the inherent risk of escalating tensions, potentially leading to unintended military conflict.
A dangerous game.
Very much so. The key takeaway is that a clear understanding of the shifting balance of power is just essential for navigating international relations effectively.
Okay, let's try and bring some of these big concepts down to earth with specific historical examples. Let's start with the Dutch Empire. How did they fit this cycle?
The Dutch. They experienced a remarkably rapid rise during their golden age, around 1650 or so.
What drove it?
Driven by significant economic strength, highly sophisticated financial markets for the time, and a powerful navy that controlled crucial trade routes. This economic and naval dominance allowed the Dutch guilder to become the world's first truly global reserve currency.
The first reserve currency, wow.
Yeah. Their rise was a classic example, really, of the benefits of strong leadership. A highly educated population, a culture of innovation, a thriving capitalist system, extensive international trade. They had it all.
But it didn't last forever.
No. A series of costly wars with rival powers, particularly England, eventually led to their financial decline and the erosion of the guilder's status as the dominant global reserve currency. The key insight here is that even dominant powers face challenges from rising competitors and just the sheer cost of maintaining their global influence.
Okay, so the Dutch declined, and then came the era of the British Empire.
Right. The British Empire's ascent to global dominance followed its decisive victories over the Dutch, and then later the French under Napoleon. Britain became the leading world power through that combination of its strong industrial economy, the workshop of the world, and its powerful Royal Navy, ruling the waves.
Industrial and military might.
And also the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment period, with its emphasis on debate, education, the rise of transnational intellectual elites. That also played a significant role in Britain's rise.
But they had rivals, too.
Oh, absolutely. Britain faced persistent geopolitical rivals, France, Russia, the United States, eventually, a rising Germany. Fast forward to after World War I, the New World Order established by the Treaty of Versailles, while intended to secure peace.
Yeah, it didn't work out so well.
Unfortunately, it contained harsh, punitive terms for the defeated powers, especially Germany, which inadvertently helped create the conditions that led to World War II.
So the seeds of the next conflict were sown.
Often the case. The post-World War I period saw an initial return to peace, some prosperity. But this was followed by significant debt accumulation, widening wealth gaps, ultimately contributing to the Great Depression. The key insight is that the seeds of future conflict can often be sown in the aftermath of major wars and shifts in the global order.
And how did the United States eventually rise to become the dominant global power after Britain?
Well, the United States' path was initially somewhat hindered by a relatively underdeveloped financial system. They had frequent banking panics in the early years.
Right before the Fed.
Exactly. The eventual establishment of a central bank, the Federal Reserve, was a crucial step in stabilizing its financial system. The U.S. dollar ultimately rose to become the world's reserve currency after World War II, initially linked to gold under the Bretton Woods system.
Which ended in 71.
Right. Nixon severed that direct link to gold in 1971. This shift was followed by various cycles of debt accumulation, monetary policy adjustments. You had the high inflation of the 70s, the Volcker shock, the tightening in the early 80s. Then fast forward again, this 2008 financial crisis. That led to unprecedented monetary policies, near zero interest rates, quantitative easing, basically printing money.
Oh.
which helped stabilize the financial system, yes, but also significantly boosted the prices of financial assets, contributing to increased wealth inequality.
So managing the currency and financial system is critical.
Absolutely critical to long-term stability and global influence. Key insight there.
Okay, how does China's historical trajectory fit into these patterns? It seems different somehow.
It does present a somewhat different picture. China's historical cycle is characterized by this long period of relative decline through the 19th and much of the 20th centuries, followed by a remarkably rapid economic rise after Deng Xiaoping's reforms kicked off in 1978.
An incredible turnaround.
Truly incredible. Initially, this rapid growth was achieved without accumulating excessive levels of debt, but debt has increased significantly since the 2008 global financial crisis as they stimulated their economy.
And
Under Xi Jinping, there have been concerted efforts to manage this growing debt while still pursuing economic reforms, technological development. China now rivals the United States in many key economic and technological areas, but still lags behind significantly in terms of the U.S. dollar's dominant reserve currency status.
does China's long history play into this?
Absolutely. China's long history of imperial dynasties, the Song, the Yuan, the Ming, it reveals these recurring patterns. Rise, periods of internal decline often linked to financial problems like mismanagement of paper money back then, and external threats. Current Chinese leaders are acutely aware of these historical lessons.
And that reserve currency status is a big deal.
Huge deal. It's often called an exorbitant privilege. It allows a country to incur more debt in its own currency, which others have to hold. The key insight is that China's rapid ascent represents a significant shift in the global balance of power, drawing on both its historical lessons and its modern economic dynamism.
Okay, this brings us squarely to the current state of affairs. The ongoing tensions, the various forms of conflict between the United States and China. What kind of war is being waged right now in Dalio's framework?
Right now, the U.S. and China are engaged in multiple forms of that warfare we talked about, but short of direct military conflict.
With what?
You've got the trade economic war tariffs, restrictions, the technology war, intense competition in AI, 5G, semiconductors, a capital war, potentially involving restrictions on financial flows, holdings, and a geopolitical war vying for influence in different regions.
So 4 out of the 5 are active.
Pretty much. While a direct military conflict isn't happening now, the risks of escalation are certainly present and concerning.
And the relationship remains tense.
Very. Despite that limited Phase 1 trade agreement a while back, there remains this strong bipartisan consensus in the U.S. for a more hawkish stance on China.
How does the tech war look?
Well, the U.S. probably still holds an overall advantage in some key areas, but China is rapidly catching up, even taking the lead in others, like 5G infrastructure deployment.
What about geopolitically?
Geopolitically, China's growing economic influence allows it to offer significant benefits to many countries. The U.S. traditionally relies more on its military alliances, though there are now questions in some regions about the U.S.'s willingness or ability to protect allies.
And the capital war.
The potential for a capital war exists. If the U.S. were to take significant action against Chinese holdings of dollar assets, for instance, that could, however, undermine confidence in the dollar's reserve currency status. And it would further incentivize Russia, China, others to develop alternative payment systems.
So it's a double-edged sword.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You also see potential for proxy wars, where each side backs different factions in regional conflicts. And it's crucial to remember these countries have fundamentally different economic and political systems, rooted in very different histories and cultures.
And Taiwan.
Taiwan remains a major potential flashpoint in this complex relationship, with deeply differing views on its strategic importance and how its status should be resolved. The risk of an unnecessary war, maybe from miscalculation or tit-for-tat escalation, especially for a dominant power facing a rising challenger, that risk is significant.
So multifaceted competition across many domains with real risk of escalation.
That's the key insight, yeah. A very complex and potentially dangerous situation.
Looking ahead then, what does the future potentially hold based on these cycles? And what are some of the key indicators we should be watching?
Well, big long-term trends, global population growth, average life expectancy, overall improvements in living standards. Those tend to evolve in relatively predictable ways over really long periods. They're often less affected by shorter-term crises.
But the crises still hurt.
Oh, absolutely. It's important not to underestimate the significant damage that these shorter-term cycles and bumps, severe depressions, major wars, even pandemics can inflict, even if they look like small dips on those super long-term mega macro charts. It's a warning against just extrapolating recent positive trends indefinitely.
So watch the bumps. How?
To anticipate important changes, we need to pay attention to both leading indicators, things that tend to foreshadow future developments, and coincident indicators, which reflect the current state of affairs. And that includes both quantifiable economic data and more qualitative assessments of social and political trends. Both matter.
What are some of the most critical determinants, those key factors, that will likely shape the future in the coming, say, 5–10 years?
5 key determinants really stand out as particularly influential for the near to medium-term future.
Okay, the top 5.
First, the rate and direction of innovation. Second, that long-term debt and capital market cycle we discussed. Third, the internal order disorder cycle within major powers. Fourth, the external order disorder cycle between nations, especially U.S.-China. And fifth, significant acts of nature, including the impacts of climate change.
Let's touch on those briefly. Innovation.
The accelerating pace of innovation, particularly in thinking-related technologies, computing, AI that has the potential to dramatically increase productivity and living standards. Huge potential upside.
Debt.
The debt burden gauge, looking at debt levels, deficits, debt service costs, who holds the debt, credit ratings that gives valuable insights into potential declines in the value of money, potential crises.
Internal conflict.
The rising levels of internal conflict, political polarization, particularly noted in the U.S., that's a crucial indicator to monitor for stability.
External conflict.
Similarly, the intensity of the conflict between the U.S. and China, which is currently elevated, will be a major factor shaping the global landscape.
And acts of nature.
Finally, the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, the broader impacts of global warming, that represents a significant and growing challenge with major economic costs. The key insight is that these interconnected factors will really drive the major trends and challenges of the coming decade.
You mentioned some resources for tracking some of this data and analysis. Where can people look?
Yes, Ray Dalio's organization, Bridgewater, they provide publicly available computer-generated reports. They include things like 10-year GDP growth projections and readings on these various gauges we've discussed. You can find them at economicprinciples.org.
Economicprinciples.org.
Okay, their backtesting suggests a reasonable degree of predictive accuracy. For the next 10 years specifically, the most important dynamics to watch closely will likely be the short-term debt economic cycle, your standard business cycle, the internal political cycle within leading nations, and the ongoing escalation of U.S.-China competition.
And where are we in the short-term cycle?
The current short-term debt cycle, for reference, began its expansionary phase back in April 2020, right after the initial economic shock of the pandemic.
Okay. Finally then, based on Dalio's Power Index, which tries to quantify the overall strength and trajectory of nations, where do some of the major global powers currently stand? Let's start with the U.S.
Right, the overall power index is on a scale from 0 to 1. Currently, the United States scores 0.77, ranking it number 1.
Still number 1. What are its strengths and weaknesses according to the index?
Key strengths are in its capital markets, its status as a global financial center, dynamism in tech and innovation, and the quality of its higher education. Areas of concern include a moderately high debt burden and only average expected future growth. It's still strong in trade, military strength, economic output, average reserve currency status.
And internally.
Internally, the risk is assessed as low currently, though with typical levels of wealth, opportunity, values gaps, and average internal political conflict. The big challenge is significant external disorder, primarily due to that competition with China.
Okay, and China, where do they rank?
China currently ranks second, very close behind, with a score of 0.76.
Neck and neck. Strengths.
Strengths are particularly notable in trade and overall economic output, where it's actually slightly ahead of the U.S. now and growing fastest. Also improving trends in tech, innovation, military, and education systems.
Weaknesses or challenges?
Also has a moderately high debt burden, but its expected future growth is above average. Internal order risk is also assessed as low, typical gaps, average internal conflict. And like the U.S., faces significant external disorder due to the U.S. relationship.
Okay, what about the Eurozone as a whole?
The Eurozone has a power index of 0.55, placing it third. Its economic and financial position is seen as moderately unfavorable. Moderately high debt burden, low expected future growth.
Strengths?
Strengths include strong positions in international trade, average reserve currency status, strong economic output overall, average military strength developed markets, internal order risk is low, typical gaps, average conflict.
And maybe one more example, France.
France comes in 8th with a power index of 0.25. Its economic and financial position is rated unfavorable. Moderately high debt burden, low expected growth. Average strength in trade, military, average market development. Internal order risk is low, with actually a narrower wealth opportunity values gap compared to some others, and average internal conflict.
Okay, interesting rankings. So to summarize our deep dive today, it really seems empires do rise and fall following these cyclical patterns,
Right.
driven by fundamental, interconnected determinants: debt, innovation, internal stability, external relations.
That's the core idea. Yeah.
And understanding these cycles, the interplay of these factors, it's crucial for interpreting the really complex dynamics of the global landscape today. Leading powers like the US and China are clearly navigating different stages of these cycles, engaged in these various forms of competition with potentially huge long-term consequences.
Exactly. And for you, our listener, hopefully gaining an understanding of these big cycles provides a valuable framework, right? Yeah. A mental model for interpreting the often confusing events unfolding around us. Yeah. And maybe for anticipating potential future challenges, opportunities too.
Yeah, it allows you to move beyond just reacting to the daily headlines and maybe develop a more informed perspective on the deeper forces that are shaping our world.
That's a goal.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. Based on everything we've discussed today, the stages of the big cycle, the key determinants, the historical precedents, what stage do you believe the world is currently in? And what might the historical patterns suggest about what could happen next?
Good question to ponder.
We definitely encourage you to delve deeper into the data, maybe explore those detailed reports available at economicprinciples.org, and really form your own informed conclusions about the future.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. We really hope this exploration has provided you with some valuable insights into the powerful forces shaping our world and these recurring patterns of history.
What you've just absorbed from changing world order and national cycles is not optional knowledge. It's survival intelligence. Because while others are distracted by headlines, you now see the patterns behind the chaos. But be warned. Understanding. The rise and fall of nations without acting on it is like holding the blueprint to a fortress and building nothing. In a world governed by cycles, those who delay learning are condemned to be ruled by those who didn't. Right now, smash that subscribe button like your future depends on it, because it does. Join our tribe of future builders and top-tier thinkers by diving into the exclusive resources linked below. This is where high performers come to separate from the herd. Our panel is about to unlock deeper applications of today's most critical takeaways, real-world moves you can make before the next global shift hits. But first, there's one final step. And it's not for the faint of heart. This is your ultimate proving ground. Are you ready to solidify your mental edge? To truly master these principles and rise above those still trapped in the cycle? Then, face the challenge. The knowledge check begins now. Let's see if you're among those who will rise or be left behind.